So in this video, I want to talk about classifying consumers or heterotrophs. And one of the ways of doing that is based on what they do to digest their food. Most animals are what we call internal heterotrophs, which means they ingest the food, and inside their bodies they're going to go ahead and process that, digest into the basic nutrients, which then get spread through the system. Meanwhile, you also have external heterotrophs like fungus, which what they do is that they sit on whatever they want to eat and they throw chemicals at it, which digest the food or breaks it down outside their bodies, and then they ingest that or the nutrients inside of their organism. But that means that fungus are great decomposers because they basically break down whatever's outside into constituent parts. And some of it ends up inside of them, but a lot of it also goes back to the ecosystem. But it's interesting about it is the difference between where the digestion is taking place. Does it happen inside the organism or outside the organism? And that's actually very important because it's how we differentiate between animals and fungus. Both are multicellular organisms and both are eukaryotes. But the biggest difference between them is that most animals are going to be internal heterotrophs that consume food and digest it inside their organism, and most fungus are going to be external heterotrophs, which digest the food outside the organism and then ingest the nutrients. Another way of differentiating between consumers is talking about whether they're going to be generalists or specialists when it comes to what they eat. Humans are what we call generalists, and the term for that is polyphage. Poly means many, phage means eating. So a polyphage is something that eats several kinds of foods, and humans will eat anything from bugs to salad, you know? You'd be surprised at what different cultures around the world eat. Meanwhile, you have something like the panda bear, which only eats one type of food. It's very specific. And that means that if that food is not available, the panda bear starves. And there's a lot of examples of that in nature, actually. Now, you may ask yourself, what is the advantage of being a specialist? Wouldn't it make more sense to be like a human and eating all kinds of stuff? True. But that takes time to evolve the system in order to be able to process all those different kinds of food. So sometimes it's more efficient to just specialize on something, especially if there's no competition. Nobody else is eating that, or if you can outcompete anything else that's trying to eat that. And so there are polyphages like humans or monophages or specialists like the panda bear. You can also classify consumers based on what they do to actually acquire their food. Or the mode of ingestion, how they get the food inside. Some of them are called filter feeders. Now, these animals are going to be animals which kind of like sit in one place, like, for example, sponges or anemones or cnidarians, coral. All of these are examples of primitive animals, actually, but what they do is that they're sessile. They're pretty much stuck to the rock, and they don't really move around. They sit there and wait for the water to come through and bring with it nutrients that they need, and they filtrate that stuff off the water. So they're called filter feeders because they don't move around. They just basically filter the water that goes through them. Another kind, it's called deposit feeders, and those are things like crabs and other crustaceans that live in the bottom of the ocean and eat off the bottom and whatever's in the soil, in the rock. And it's very common about that, deposit feeders. Earthworms could possibly be another example of that. Another one, it's called fluid feeders, and you see the mosquito there on the bottom left as an example of that. It will eat a liquid, and that's where it will get its sustenance. Other animals that will eat things like honey, or other animals that will eat things like the nectar of flowers. Those are the good examples of fluid eaters. There's also bulk eaters, and that's like you and me, or like the bird you see in this picture, that eat large chunks of stuff all at once, and that's a bulk eater. And finally you have REM, or suction eaters, and that's the ones that kind of like open their mouth, and it's very common in the water, and they will just walk by or swim by, and whatever's on the way will go inside, and they will kind of filter through that. Sometimes they're also referred to as filter feeders, but true filter feeders are kind of stuck and the water goes through by them, while a ram eater swims to let the water move instead. So it's like it doesn't rely on the movement of the water. I cause the water to move through me. Whales are examples of that. Some whales will do that. Some others will hunt, but some of them are filter feeders like this, so called suction or ram feeders. And some, like this fish, just open their mouth and wait for something to go inside as they swim forward. So these are the different kinds of separating animals by ingestion. Another way of separating animals is by the type of cellular digestion that takes place. Now, this is different from the first thing we talked about versus internal versus external. Remember, internal heterotroph is someone that eats inside their body, they process their food, while external never gets the food inside their body. They process it outside. They just absorb the nutrients. This is talking more about where the digestion takes place. Automatically, any kind of fungus is going to be what we call extracellular digestion, because obviously they get the nutrients already digested and it never even goes in their body. But we are also extracellular digestive systems, because the majority of the processing of the food happens outside our cells. Now, it still happens inside of us, which makes us internal heterotrophs, but our kinds of digestion is, for the most part, extracellular. What that means is that we have systems, we have organs designed to secrete chemicals and break down the food, even though it's inside of us, but it's outside the cell. So we have the liver, the pancreas, gallbladder, intestines, stomach, all of these things work together, the mouth, salivary glands, all of these things work together in tandem to actually break down the food, and then the bloodstream picks up the nutrients and takes it to the cells, which then use these things, which by now are basically already the nutrients that you need to do things in the cell. So the cells don't really need to break down the food. The food is already broken down by the time it gets to the cells. So both fungus and all the other animals are going to be extracellular digestion. The difference is that the fungus digests outside the organism, which also makes them extra or external heterotrophs. We are internal heterotrophs, but we do extracellular digestion. Another kind of cellular digestion is called Myzel Psychosis. And this is really, what it is that this unicellular organism has what it looks like a needle. You see it over here? And this needle will kind of puncture through whatever cell it's trying to attack, and then it will go inside and kind of suck up the nutrients from inside the cell that it's consuming, that's predating on. Very interesting way of cellular digestion. So it will secrete chemicals which digest the cell, and it will suck up the nutrients after. Very interesting way to get things inside of it. Another way of cellular digestion is called phagocytosis. Now in phagocytosis, which is, for example, what amoebas do, and you see the example there on the bottom left, is that the cell will extend these things which are called pseudopods, and it will envelop whatever it's trying to eat, and they will eat this huge chunk, and then once inside the cell, it will break that stuff down. Now that means this is bulk eating. It's eating in huge pieces in terms of cellular dimensions, you know? And a lot of organisms will do that, but it takes a lot of specialization to do that, because the cell has to be able to extend these projections of the cytoplasm called pseudopods. Some cells in animals will do that. For example, the white blood cells called phagocytes, a special type of white blood cells in humans, will do that to kinds of invaders. For example, this yeast cell you see on the right side is being phagocytized. You know, the phagocyte is going around those pseudopods and it's going to envelop it completely. And once inside the phagocyte, that's going to be broken down. But remember that the majority of the eating in animals is going to be happening through the organs. It's going to be extracellular. That doesn't mean there's not some cells in the body which are capable of doing this kind of digestion too, and digesting things inside of it. Speaking of which, digestion doesn't necessarily end outside the cell, regardless of which way you do it. The cells have ways to handle the food once it goes inside of it. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we do cytology later in the year. But basically, however you get the stuff inside the cell, either it's going to be receptor-mediated pinocytosis, or phagocytosis, sometimes cells eat bulk things, big things. Then what the cell does with that is that it will merge its lysosomes, which is a special type of organelle full of digestive enzymes and acids and things like that, and it will merge with that, with the incoming material, and then digest the material and break it down to constituent parts that the cell can actually use. And in fact, the cell would do the same thing with old parts of itself that it wants to destroy. And if the old parts are large, like a mitochondria, it's called a macroautophagy, when it destroys a whole organelle. And when it's tiny little things like a protein that the cell no longer needs, it's called microautophagy, which means it's eating itself, but in small chunks. Regardless of what it is, it's important to understand that digestion can happen inside of cells. But for the most part, animals will get the nutrients already broken down to smaller little bits before they get inside the cells, which makes us extracellular digestion or types. So that's another way of classifying the way of eating, based on the kind of cellular digestion that's taking place. Another way of classifying eating by feeding behavior is by looking at the food type. Now, we already talked about this, but there's a lot of names for carnivores which specialize in certain kinds of food, and I'm going to talk about some of these names which are out there. So, for example, you have those mites or fleas that you see on the top left. They're called hematophages because they're eating blood. Hemo for blood, phage for eating. You also have insectivores like this bat, that eats insects. You also have special types of insectivores which specialize in ants, like the anteater, and that's called myrmecophage. You also have some bugs which are capable of eating their own carcasses, and by that I mean some bugs are made of keratin. They have extracellular skeletons, and sometimes they will molt that, and they will come out of it, and they will eat that old skeleton, and that's called keratophage, when you're able to actually eat and process keratin. And you see that happening over there. There's some bugs actually eating the tusk of the elephant, which is made of that material. You also have lepidophages, and those are fish that eat the scales of other fish. So it's very common among parasite fish. They will actually eat and start eating up the scales of the other fish. And as you see, very tiny fish there in the center. There's also anthropophagy, and that's things that eat humans. And unfortunately, throughout history, some humans were known to do that. But there's also sharks and some types of lions which have been known to prefer to eat human meat. Crazy stuff out there. Very rare, but it happens. There's also molluscivores, which are types of animals which will eat mussels, such as clams or snails, like the bird you see there eating a snail. And you also see mucophages, and those are things that eat mucus, like, for example, the parasite that you see growing in the gills of the big fish there on the right side. They're eating the mucus of the fish. They're not even eating the gills. They're eating just the mucus that the fish is producing. They also have ophiophagy, which is eating snakes, and that's very common. There's also piscivores, which are the eaters of fish, and there's also ovivores, which are the eaters of birds. And I actually love this picture. It's actually a spider which specializes in hunting birds. Isn't that crazy? Yeah, but it does happen. The bird gets trapped in the spider. And you also have spongivores, which eat sponges, and a lot of types of slugs and snails in the water will do that. And there's also other types which are not mentioned. This is just a kind of like an overview. Among the herbivores, there's also special types of herbivores. You have folivores, which eat foliage, like the koala that you see. You have the frugivores, which eat fruits, like the bird in the middle. You have gramivores, which eat grass, like the cow. You also have granivores, which eat seeds, like the bird you see on the left side in the center. You also have nectivores, which eat nectar, like that butterfly sucking out the nectar of the flower. You also have pollinovores, which eat pollen. An example of that is that insect you see on the right side. You also have xylophagy, which are animals that eat wood, and like termites, for example, like the one you see in that picture. But all of these are eating plant products, so they're all types of herbivores. Of course, you also have omnivores, or animals that actually will eat different kinds of things, both animals and plants. So it's a mixture of a carnivore and a herbivore all in one. You also have fungivores. Fungivores are organisms that live off fungus. Some types of ants, for example, they don't actually eat those leaves. They just bring those leaves home, and then they leave the leaves inside and let the fungus grow on them. And then what they end up eating is the fungus that grows in the leaves. And here you see several other kinds of animals that also specialize in eating fungus. By the way, humans will also eat fungus. So in a way, we're special types of omnivores. When you eat those like mushrooms, there's a fungus. You also have bacteriivores, and those are tiny, usually organisms that will specialize in eating bacteria, like these nematodes, which are kinds of worms, which are hunters of little bacteria. They will eat the little bacteria. They're also microscopic organisms in this case. You also have other kinds of organisms that specialize in eating bad things, like coprophagy. Birds are known for eating poop. That's what coprophagy is. There's detrivores. We already talked about those. They move around and hunt for dead matter. There's geophagy, which is eating the dirt. Sometimes dirt has nutrients, and some types of birds are known to go and actually eat some of the dirt to get the nutrients off the dirt. There's also osteophagy, which is eating bones. Of course, dogs are known for doing that. There's scavengers, which find food that others are already done with. There's also decomposers, like fungus, which break down dead matter. All of these are eaters of strange types of food. And there's also some unusual type of eating in the animal world, including things like cannibalism, people that eat their own kind, autophagy, which is eating parts of yourself, sexual cannibalism, which is eating someone that right after you have sex, you eat them. Black widows are known to do that. There's kleptoparasitism, which are organisms that steal food from other organisms. There's trophallaxis, which is basically animals that eat something and then they kind of vomit into the mouth of someone else. That is very common. There's oophagy, which is eating eggs while it's still inside the mother. And there's also ovophagy, which is eating the eggs once outside. Lots of animals are known to do that. There's pyrotophagy, which is eating the youngsters of a kind. There's pica, which is eating things which are not actually nutritious. You're just eating because for the sake of it. Like some people actually eat hair because they have psychological problems. And there's also placentophagy, which is eating of placenta. So there's a lot of strange eating behaviors out there in the wild. Hope you had fun with all these key terms.